For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them, and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents? See, I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow, and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him, and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
That's a rather abrupt parable of Christ. It's familiar to most of us. It's commonly referred to as the parable of the talents, and yet, even though many of us have heard it many times, we can't help but get jarred, uneasy. The language in here is so bitter. It's language of anger and damnation, and we also sympathize with this poor, unfortunate slave that technically didn't do anything wrong. He didn't lose the master's money. So how do we look at this parable? The first thing we have to look is the context, because I've said it 1,000 times, not even half, 90% of biblical interpretation is context. You have to understand how and why and when and where all of this took place. And when Jesus said these words, it was in the final days of his life. Scholars are not in universal agreement on this, but the overwhelming percentage of them say this was probably said on what we would consider as Tuesday of Holy Week. Here in a couple of days, Jesus would be, by Friday of this week, he would be dead on a cross. And these are his final days. He knows where he's going. And this parable also is one in a series of prophetic teachings and parables that dominate the chapters 24 and 25 of Matthew's account. At first, there's a prediction that this temple, this very building where Jesus is teaching, is going to be destroyed, and the new temple is going to arise in the person of Jesus Christ. And he was simultaneously predicting the destruction of the temple, which would happen eventually, but more importantly, the significance of Christ as the manifestation of the temple in the presence of God. He also, in this conversation, predicted his own death and his suffering, and the future suffering of those who would call upon his name, recognizing that a life dedicated to Christ was not going to be all sunshine and flowers, but was going to have some toil and some difficulty. And then he preaches a series of parables that could loosely be described as the keep awake parables. The keep awake parables. And they all have a similar common theme, and that is there is going to come a time, and you have to be ready. And the time to get ready is not after you realize the time has come. The point of all of these parables is you have to be ready now. And the first of those parables reminds us that Jesus is going to return someday with no warning. And he says very clearly, even Jesus Christ does not know the time. I find it always very interesting when somebody comes up with the latest prediction of when Jesus is going to return, as if they've got it all figured out. And I turn to Matthew 24 and I think, okay, Jesus said he didn't know, and there would be no warning, so how do you got figured out that you're smarter than Jesus? I mean, I've never understood that, but it works. After that, he talks about faith and fidelity and reminding us that being faithful to God is not a when you get around to it kind of thing, but it's something that requires daily diligence. And you're either part of God or you're not part of God. And the time to make that decision is not after the second coming, but long before. And the contrast that he also puts in there is, are you going to live life for yourself and your own indulgence and do what's best for you? Or are you going to live life for God and the faith and the family of faith? Are you going to live a life of service and sacrifice, or a life of violence and debauchery? And Jesus puts these choices right out before each of us. And then he talks about being prepared in the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, which basically reiterates this whole concept of be alert, be ready, be on top of things now. Don't wait for something else to happen. The next parable is this one that we have today, oftentimes called the parable of the talents, which tends to be deceptive. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then after the parable of the talents that we just heard, the last one is the parable of the judgment of the nations, when Jesus separates the sheep from the goats, and those who enter into heavenly rest are ones that cared for the sick and gave water to those that are thirsty, and clothing to those that were naked, and food to those that were hungry, and visited those who were sick and in prison, and the ones that didn't make the cut. So you see, in this whole sequence of parables, this little story of the parable of the talents, as we call it, falls into a broader context of being faithful and alert. And as we look deeper into this parable of the talents, we remember a couple of things. First, it's about faith and fidelity, now and from this point forward. Jesus, in this parable, in very simplistic terms, is challenging the church to hold strong to their faith and their fidelity to Christ. And fidelity doesn't mean we follow Christ when it's convenient and do our own thing when there's something more fun that came along. It's an everyday decision. The second thing, it's important to note, this parable uses the image or the illustration of money. But this parable is not about money. Oftentimes in the United States, in our capitalistic and money-focused society, we try to make this parable about money and prudent investments and so forth. But that's not what this is about. It's just using that illustration, that image, because the parable is about us. And the Greek word that is used in here is talanta, which is where we get the English, or the English translation, talent. But this is really a deceptive thing when we translate Greek into English in this, because the parable is not about talents in the sense of skills and abilities. The Greek word talanta refers explicitly to the balance or the scale that is used to measure out money according to weight. It has nothing to do with gifts or abilities, and it's just a bizarre similarity of language sounds that we give it the word talents, but it's kind of confusing. Remember, it's about money. I mean, it's not about money, but it's about us. And then the other side is that, this is the third point, this parable is about the contrast between two types of people. Those who play it safe, like the slave that got the 1 talent, burying those things and leaving them alone, and those who take risk, as in the one who got the 5 talents and the one who got the 2 talents. So here is our challenge when we look at this talent or look at this parable and try to discern what it means and how to appropriate it. The parable is about faith and fidelity. It's in the context of how we apply the end times. And it uses the image of money, but it's not about money. And all of these factors combined remind us that this is fundamentally a parable about using our faith to take risks. And let's face it, I'm no expert in investments. I'm about as dumb as a stump when it comes to using money to make money. But I am smart enough to know that any investment strategy that doubles your money is got to be risky. If you have any amount of money and you want to set out to invest that and double that money, as these 2 servants have done, there is a tremendous amount of risk involved. And I've always wondered when I read this parable why Jesus didn't add in a caveat. What would have happened to the servant that invested the money and lost it all? I mean, Jesus didn't tell the story that way, so we can only speculate. But I'm reminded of our story. Think of our story. For years, and I mean years, I've only been with this congregation 16 years, and this problem predates my coming here, but for years, this was a congregation afraid to take a risk. Afraid to reach out and do something, shall we say, crazy. And we even paid money for an expert to come in, and the expert told us, you've got to take risks. You've got to consider what it would be to divest of your property and your building and start over somewhere else and regenerate. And you know what our congregation said? No. We buried ourselves. And the money kept going down. Our deficit spending kept getting worse and worse. Some of our key givers died. And we were looking at a looming financial crisis. But rather than take risks, we buried ourselves deeper and deeper and deeper until we got this grandiose idea to merge with the Presbyterians. And you know what? That was the beginning, because that involved a level of risk that this congregation had never tried before. We went and we worshiped with people we didn't know in a building that wasn't ours and sold our precious property on Church Street because for the first time we were willing to risk everything. And boy, did we risk. It was December the 4th last year. Remember that day? When it seemed like everything we had invested was taken away from us. And there were those that wanted to take what was left and bury it in the ground because in their mind we were a failed congregation with a business model that wouldn't work, with a financial balance sheet that was destined for bankruptcy, and a ministry that was non-existent. So after that, where did we end up? In a funeral home. In a funeral home. And we spent our Christmas worshiping in a place where people only come to remember the dead. And I'll have to say for myself and for I think many in this congregation, that was a low point. Because we didn't know. We didn't know. And then we moved from a funeral home to a Jewish temple that was very nice, but it wasn't ours. It didn't feel right. I mean, we're very gracious for their gifts, and it was a necessary place for us to lick our wounds and try to find ourselves and determine who we were and how things were going to come. And we were there just long enough to learn about this property and go through the process of acquiring it and then moving in, and then right after Easter, after the celebration of resurrection, we came into this space. And even then, in spite of our tremendous willingness to risk, we were here one Sunday, and what happened? We got broken into and they stole our stuff. It's enough to make one say, why did we even try? That's our story. And look at us now. We are here today because we chose to take risks in faith. How many people do we know who chose to walk away from a way of life or from something that was destructive and harmful, even though it was comfortable and familiar, in faith to go and be and do something bigger and stronger and better? How many of us, ourselves or somebody we know, took the risk, the real risk, to step out of a bad situation into the unknown without any confidence whatsoever that it was the right decision, only to find out that you were phenomenally blessed afterwards?
You take the risk?
The thing about risk is, if you know the outcome and it's guaranteed, there's no risk. The one with the one talent knew that as long as that money was underground and he checked on it, it was going to still be there and he wouldn't get in trouble with the master. The ones that invested the 5 talents and the 2 talents, they had no idea whether the market would go up or down, but they had faith. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for and unseen. We know this passage. And when we walked out of that building on Church Street a year or so ago into what we thought was going to be a future with the Presbyterians, did any of us even imagine we'd end up here? And yet, look at us today. It's the risk. And what this parable challenges us to do is avoid the temptation to be safe. Because this parable turns the idea of faith and fidelity and risk upside down. This passage challenges the church to take a risk, to talk to the people that otherwise we would be afraid of. This challenges the church to be the people that are not like us. This challenges us to be the church by reaching out to those that we do not understand, not so that we can make them like us, but rather so that we can bring the love of God into their lives, where they're at, for who they are, because God loves people for who they are, not for what the church thinks they can turn them into. That's important. Don't forget that. The purpose of the church is not to create people like us, but to bring God's love into the world right where it needs to be. And that's bold, that's sacrificial, that's being on guard and ready for Christ's return and engaged in holistic ministry. Ministry that brings wholeness out of fragmentation, ministry that brings a cup of cold water to the stranger, that speaks out for those that don't have a voice, that stands in the gap for people that need the extra assurance and the encouragement and the blessing, that speaks truth to power and tells power when they are wrong, and is not afraid to take the negative consequences when people accuse you of being anti-whatever. It is proclaiming God's hope, God's peace, and God's love to the world. This parable challenges every man and woman in this room to forget about being safe and get outside and take the risk. Thanks be to God.